Hi, everyone. I'm Allison Atkins, the Assistant Director at the Kennebunk Free Library. Thank you all for joining us tonight. This is the third in a series exploring Maine's Climate Action Plan. Tonight, we'll be discussing energy. We've also had an overview of the plan and discussed natural and working lands in previous weeks. Going forward, we'll be discussing transportation, buildings, and infrastructure. That's next week. Then community resilience and coastal and marine issues in May. We do have everyone but the presenters muted tonight. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat. For those of you not familiar with Zoom, you can just hover over the bottom of your screen and it'll pop up a menu. The chat button is in the center of that menu. Please be sure the drop-down menu in the chat box is set to everyone so that the facilitators can see your questions. I'll be posting a list of helpful links from our presenters in just a moment. You're welcome to copy them to explore later. So I want to give a huge thank you to all of our presenters tonight and to the Planeteers for the tremendous amount of work that they put into organizing this program. Now I'm going to turn you over to Jen from the Planeteers. Jen, you're muted.
There we go. Let's try that again. Thank you so much, Allison. I am so glad to be here tonight, and I am so grateful for all of the wonderful speakers that we have lined up and folks in the audience. And thank you so much to the library, the Kennebunk Free Library, and Allison for doing everything that they've done to help us get this great Planet Talk series out to you all. My name is Jen Armstrong, and I'm a member of the Planeteers of Southern Maine. We are a grassroots environmental group located in the Kennebunks. Our organization is acting to stem the tide of climate change while promoting sustainable living and protecting the creatures, contours, and climate of Mother Earth. We Planeteers of Southern Maine organize both Planet Talks and Planet Walks in an effort to invite people to come together to work on creating new and more sustainable lives. We are nonpartisan, and we hope that everyone joining us recognizes that they have something to offer and a unique role to play in the change making. Our walks include community cleanups and monthly beach erosion monitoring in conjunction with UME and Maine Sea Grant, a program that you will hear about in our exciting final session on Tuesday, May 18th. We report our findings on our social media platforms, as well as to Maine Sea Grant, NOAA, the Ocean Conservancy, World Oceans Day, and Gaia. Our talks have included regenerative and backyard farming, the importance of planting and building for pollinators, seeding native and wildflowers, carbon emissions and sequestration, sea level rise, marine debris, bioplastics, PFAS, and the toxicity of plastics. All of these topics will be revisited in the April sessions, which deal with the Maine Climate Action Plan sectors of land use, energy, transportation and building and infrastructure. I'm happy to say that thanks to popular demand, some of the presenters who've joined us in the past will serve as panelists again. Sometimes we walk and talk. In 2019, prior to COVID, we visited with area restaurants, 50 in the Kennebunks alone, to explore greening practices, specifically deplasticizing. We were excited to learn not only that most were holding internal meetings to discuss better practices, but that many are already taking steps to improve their environmental impact. This effort and a related one underway at the Rachel Carson Wildlife Refuge will be discussed in our session on Tuesday, May 4th. Instead of organizing a celebration in honor of science and Earth, as we've done in years prior to the pandemic, we are thrilled to be rolling out this series of Planet Talks. Thrilled because we have Maine's Climate Action Plan as a blueprint. Thrilled with the experts joining us tonight. Thrilled to have our library partner with us in this project, and thrilled to have all of you here. We hope you find tonight's session on energy meaningful and that you will join us again next Tuesday at 6 p.m. Also, because everyone can be a Planeteer, please consider joining us. I would like to encourage you all to get involved in the legislative process by contacting your state legislators about your concerns. Please feel free to reach out if you need any help taking the first step. Finally, and because we are grassroots, I'd like to mention that yes, we do accept donations. Thanks to Lot Home Trust, who serves as our fiscal sponsor, we're now able to offer you an easy means by which to support us. One, on our website, www.someplaneteers.org. You have to scroll all the way down to the bottom of the page to find the donate button, but it's there. And secondly, you can go to our Facebook page at Some Planeteers. There's a donation link in the About Us section, and our links will be in the chat so that you can see the exact URLs for that. Welcome to tonight's talk on energy. Next up, we have Dr. Ivan Fernandez. He is the co-chair for the Science Committee of the Maine Climate Council. We're so excited for having him here tonight. Dr. Fernandez is a soil scientist with a research program that focuses on the biochemistry and ecosystems in a changing physical and chemical climate, and is actively engaged in promoting climate adaptation in Maine. He is co-chair for the Science Committee of the Maine Climate Council, a science network member of the Union of Concerned Scientists, and a distinguished professor at the University of Maine School of Forest Resources and Climate Change Institute in Orono, Maine. Ivan has served on various U.S. EPA Science Advisory Board committees in DC, and recently chaired and continues to serve on a panel of the EPA Clean Air Scientific Advisory Committee that is evaluating secondary effects of the Clean Air Act. Welcome, Dr. Fernandez.
Well, thanks, Jen. Let me share my screen. And I appreciate the opportunity to join the Planeteers and Kennebunk, wrong place, Free Library, my apologies, to talk some more about Maine's Climate Action Plan and what we're doing here in the state of Maine. I was honored to be able to join you a couple of weeks ago talking about the larger plan. So this is just eye candy to start. My focus here is to sort of set the stage about why we're talking about energy tonight. And that's why we're talking about energy tonight. This is the Keeling curve, probably best known of the atmospheric greenhouse gas or atmospheric CO2 concentration curves from Mauna Loa, Hawaii, that was started by Ralph Keeling back in the 1950s. And it gives us a nice long-term, relatively speaking, time series of atmospheric CO2. And you can see that it's going up and up and up. And we can talk about the anatomy of that curve at great length, but my timer's counting down, and so I'm not going to do that tonight. There is a couple of things to take note as we celebrate Earth Day this week and Earth Week. Back in 1970, on the first Earth Day, the atmospheric concentration was 328 ppm. And this week it's 415 ppm. And so even though we started celebrating many decades ago, we haven't done a lot about it. And that's the problem. This is a plot of the rate of increase for each year of that climbing curve in Mauna Loa. And what these bars are telling you is that on a decadal average basis, outside of this one, each decade, the rate of increase is getting faster and faster. And that's why that curve is curved. It's not a straight line, but it's going up and up and up. And it continues even with COVID to be on that trajectory. Just to be sure that people don't get confused that this is happening only in Hawaii. Of course, it's happening everywhere. And these are traces from the Tall Towers site in Argyle, Maine, of atmospheric CO2, not as long a record. Actually, these concentrations are slightly higher than Mauna Loa because we're at the end of the pipeline of the Northeast. But they're doing the same thing. They're going up. And actually, all of the greenhouse gases are going up. And so this is methane, nitrous oxide, sulfur hexafluoride, 30, 300 and thousands times more potent than CO2. Luckily, much lower concentrations, but they're all going up and becoming increasingly important. And so it's burning fossil fuels that have put these greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Maine Won't Wait has a target, as you probably recall, of decreasing gross greenhouse gas emission. That means all of what we're putting in the atmosphere. It's not the balance, it's the gross amount. And the only way we're going to reduce the gross amount is to go to renewables and get off fossil fuels and do that fast. 45% by 2030, 50% by 2050. In addition, the governor signed the executive order to make us carbon neutral by 2045. And that is the balance of how much we emit versus how much we take up. What we are emitting our greenhouse gases here in Maine from these sources. 54% is transportation. And so that's a high priority in our transformation here in Maine. Buildings, 19 and 11% together. And then industry is about 9%, and electric power now in this scenario is 7%. And so we know where the greenhouse gases are coming from in Maine. We know where they are coming from throughout the planet. And the vast majority, we'll take a look at that later, but are coming from us burning fossil fuels. And the discussion we're having tonight is both exciting and at the heart of our ability to respond to the climate challenge. What do we need to do? You saw the curve was going up and up and up for greenhouse gas concentrations. This is from the consultants report that was input to the Maine Climate Council's work on the action plan. And this is a modeled trajectory going forward of what we need to do relative to emissions. And so while CO2 is going up, or greenhouse gases are going up, the opposite has to occur. The exact opposite has to occur relative to greenhouse gas emissions. And the following speakers are going to tell us some about what we're doing here in Maine to accomplish that. So I'm going to stop there, and I think I'll be back later on the agenda.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Let's see here. Next up, we have Michelle Putko, recently retired to Maine after 28-year career in the Army, followed by 8 years on the faculty in the Department of Mechanical Engineering at UMass Lowell. At UMass, and during 2 assignments teaching at West Point, Michelle frequently taught classes on energy and energy systems. She's currently teaching an online energy policy class at UMass Lowell. Welcome, Michelle.
I'm going to unmute and share my screen. And I'm just going to jump into a slide. So when I taught, I would preach, if you will, the concept of energy literacy. An energy literate person understands where their energy comes from, can make informed decisions with that knowledge, and can converse about energy. So when I moved to Maine 2 years ago, I thought I should get a clue about where Maine's energy comes from and how we use our energy. So this is from the Energy Information Agency, a government website that catalogs so many statistics on various energy topics. So here's Maine's energy consumption in 2018. And one thing that struck me was, look at that tall, bar of biomass. That is truly very, very unique. Most other states don't have their primary energy source from biomass. And biomass, I taught a lot about other types of energy, but have really never looked that closely at biomass. And now I'm going to look at our biomass use in electricity production. Again, when I moved to Maine, I read 80% of Maine's electricity is renewable. Like, we really don't have that far to go to get 100% renewable. But if you look at where our quote unquote renewable electricity comes from, I couldn't get a 2019 graph here, but it's of course it's hydro and wind, but there's a lot from biomass. We have the highest share of electricity from biomass from any other state in the United States. So again, that's very unique. So how should we feel about that? I think we're proud of the forestry in Maine and the pine tree state, and we love our forests. But if you look at what happens when you burn wood or wood products in a power plant, the carbon emissions are worse than a coal plant. And there are some that will say, well, yes, but that tree is going to grow back and absorb that carbon, but we're not talking about what is happening decades from now. And I found various or multiple sources that show that the carbon emissions from a biomass power plant are worse than a coal plant and much worse than a natural gas plant. So a lot of these plants burn also a wood pellet or a wood chip, and whether or not they go to a power plant or to a home for heating or they're exported. Another interesting fact about this whole carbon neutral aspect of wood pellets, we're not just taking a log, right, and throwing it into a bag or a combustor of some sort. The whole processing of making those wood pellets is an energy intensive process that we don't count when we count, wood or biomass as carbon neutral. So if the wood was left to decay in the forest, it would not have to be transported and processed and dried, and it would be play a much different role in the carbon cycle. And biomass and wood chip, wood pellet processing, it's very it's part of our main economy. And I'm not going to say we have to stop doing that. I'm simply saying that putting wood into a power plant is not carbon neutral in the short term. We are not the only people in the world that think biomass is a great carbon neutral source of energy. Just this year, there was a big move afoot in the EU, because the EU is importing so much biomass from the US. And here is just showing how we continue to do more and more each year, especially over to the United Kingdom. So we have a problem, not in Maine, it's across the world, that it's just kind of misunderstood that biomass is carbon neutral. So if we were all living hundreds of years and talking about our climate many decades ahead, biomass may, we may have a different opinion of it, but it takes so long to regrow these trees. Right now, the biomass we're burning is going to add to global warming for decades. And we also have this false sense of renewable because in most states, biomass is counted and subsidized and incentivized as a renewable source of energy. Companies that want to shift off fossil fuel can right now go to wood or wood products, and that's keeping them from shifting to truly renewable sources of energy, such as solar, wind, or hydro, which don't have a carbon footprint. So that's what I learned about biomass when I moved to Maine. And I really think, yes, we love our forests, but we need to be honest about what happens when we burn them. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Michelle. I so appreciate your insights. Do we have any questions out there for Michelle, Tom?
No, just a comment from Ivan, thanking Michelle for the presentation.
Great. Absolutely. I'm so glad to get the insight myself, Michelle, because I didn't realize that that was such a huge section of our energy sector here in Maine. So thank you.
Actually, I also added to that comment. I'd love to hear from you, Ivan, about this. As a tree.
Real briefly, I didn't make a comment.
Oh, I saw
my
Ivan's
name in the comment.
Sorry about that.
And I think that's a really important issue that Michelle raises. That the science of what she's talking about is absolutely true as to the timeline for when we consume versus when we emit. Anything that's not fossil is better than using fossil carbon because we're adding to the global cycle. But from the standpoint of short-term goals between now and 2050 to bend the curve. How biomass is handled is extremely critical, and there's been a lot of misinformation out there. So I appreciated her comments.
And then another, Bob Werthner's in the audience, I know. And Bob, for those who don't know him, he runs a film series that's usually in the UU before the pandemic, in partnership with Sierra Club. And I think the last film you showed, Bob, was called Burned. I don't know how many others in the audience have seen it, but it's all about biomass and the perils attached to that. And I actually bought a copy of that DVD from the producers that evening, with the thought of having it screened at some point in Kennebunk. Of course, that hasn't happened. But if anybody out there would like to use my copy, it is licensed for public screening, in small settings.
Could I just jump in? There's actually an article in the New York Times this morning, or at least on my iPad this morning. I can never tell which issue it's in, on this exact subject. That's a good read.
Good.
Wonderful. We'll have to check that out. All right, great. Let me see here. Thank you so much, Michelle. Next up, we have John Armand. John is a native of Minnesota and a graduate of Harvard and MIT. He joined the wind energy industry in 2006. John served for 7 years as engineering manager in a company that opened a factory in New Zealand in 2008, then built and sold over 100 half-megawatt wind turbines. John joined the University of Maine in 2013, where he leads wind blade testing and manufacturing R&D projects. We are so glad to have you here tonight, John. Thanks for being here.
Thank you. Am I successfully screen sharing?
Yes, you are.
Okay. Well, thank you, Jen. Yeah, before moving to Maine 7 years ago, I built wind turbines in New Zealand, including these that we installed in 2010. So I show this both by way of introduction and just to illustrate wind farming peacefully coexisting alongside an alternate land use, in this case, dairy farming on the North Island of New Zealand. Now, during the 20th century, wind power and solar power contributed less than 1% of the world's electricity. In the 21st century, wind and solar are rapidly growing, today contributing just over 10% of the world's electricity and rapidly growing, both wind and solar. In the US, fossil fuel, whether from burning natural gas or coal, still contributes 60% of our electricity, and nuclear power contributes 20%, and all the renewables a little bit less than 20%. In Maine, as Michelle Putko pointed out, we burn a lot of biomass. And did anybody participate in the Kenduskeag Stream canoe race on Saturday? If you did, you know we have lots of fast moving water. We're blessed with lots of water in the state of Maine. And so historically and today, we get about a third of our electricity from hydro. And in the last 15 years, a great deal of onshore wind has been developed, now contributing about 24% of Maine's electricity. And thank you very much, Michelle. I learned something a few minutes ago about the carbon footprint of the biomass, the wood burning power sector. Thank you very much for that, Michelle. Now, wind energy onshore has attracted investment naturally where the wind is. And there's this great swath of the central US from North Dakota down to West Texas that's nicknamed the Saudi Arabia of wind, because that's where the wind resource is so rich that it can be harvested relatively inexpensively. Offshore wind energy is now poised to likewise attract private investment where the offshore wind is. The Gulf of Maine and a few other waters now have the opportunity to become the Saudi Arabia of offshore wind. Offshore wind is by far Maine's largest untapped renewable energy resource. About a decade ago, estimates were completed indicating about 156 gigawatts of power capacity should all the winds in the Gulf of Maine be harvested for wind energy. A typical nuclear power plant or a large hydropower plant might be 1 gigawatt. Can you imagine the equivalent of 156 power plants just by harvesting offshore wind? So how much offshore wind do we need? How much should we harvest? Well, here's a summary of the wind energy resource expressed in terms not of power, but of energy, the kilowatt hours or megawatt hours or gigawatt hours that could be harvested if that entire resource was developed and exploited. Compare that to the total electricity consumption in Maine in 2019, and you can see that if less than 2% of the available wind power were harvested, it could meet all of our current needs. And looking ahead, if about 3% of that resource were developed, it could meet not only current needs, but the growing demand that we all look forward to in transportation, which Ivan Fernandez, I think, pointed out was 54% of our greenhouse gas emissions currently come from the transportation sector. Of course, we have to electrify the transportation sector, which means we're going to need more electricity than we're consuming today. Likewise, the home heating sector deserves to be electrified. My point is, we don't need to occupy the entire Gulf of Maine with offshore wind to provide all of this electricity demand. A very, very small percentage of it could do so. At the University of Maine, we're focused on research and development of technologies to make wind energy inexpensive and reliable. The most prominent project that our center has been pioneering and championing for a decade plus, for longer than I've been there, is the Volturnus floating foundation technology. I'm not going to try to present this in any detail. In the chat box, you'll see an hour-long primer that our executive director, Dr. Habib Dagher, presented recently through UMaine Audubon. If you want to learn all about offshore wind and floating offshore wind, there's an hour-long primer. Please refer to the link in the chat box and watch those details. The short version is this technology is not based on steel floating hulls, but concrete floating hulls. Technology that's mature. It's been used in civil engineering and bridge building for 75 years. And we're championing this technology for low cost, made in Maine, designed in Maine and made anywhere, floating hulls for offshore wind. In addition, at the University of Maine, we've been commercially testing wind blades for OEM clients for several years. And we're now starting a Department of Energy funded project to develop new technology for rapid, low cost wind blade manufacturing. So that's what's going on at the University of Maine. Our mission is, in particular, to make wind energy and offshore wind energy inexpensive and reliable. And I appreciate the opportunity to summarize what we're doing at the University of Maine to help make wind energy inexpensive and reliable. Thank you.
I have a question, John. I've heard that there have been some recent developments I know some environmentalists are concerned about birds and the threat to migrating birds. I understand there have been some developments in reducing that threat. Can you speak a little bit to that?
I'll make two comments. First of all, if you count the number of birds that are damaged by human activity or killed by human activity, the vast, vast, vast majority of birds are killed by flying into buildings. Yes, there are a couple of birds that have been killed by wind turbines, but the number is 3 or 4 orders of magnitude smaller than all of the other human activities. The other thing I'll say is yes, there is substantial technology development that's been going on for a decade plus in trying to detect oncoming birds and mitigate everything that could possibly be done to reduce the already pretty small number of birds who are harmed by wind turbines is being done, including auditory signals that divert the birds away, including curtailing the operation of wind turbines automatically when substantial numbers of birds are present. So that's what I have to say. If you look at the numbers, it's not a very compelling case can't be made that it's a large source of bird mortality. That being said, the industry is doing everything possible to minimize and mitigate the risk.
Thank you for that.
We have another question for you, John. What about the storage of energy from the wind turbines? How is that going to take place in Maine?
Short answer is I'm not an expert on that. What I will say is that, of course, wind energy can be harvested when the wind is blowing, just as solar energy can be harvested when the sun is shining. And as we increasingly exploit wind and solar and other intermittent sources of power with free fuel available forever, yes, our electricity system has to learn how to do storage more and more economically. And, battery technology is growing by leaps and bounds. I'm not an expert in battery technology. I'm only an expert in wind turbine design and wind technology. But yes, I think storage is going to be huge. And as we talk about electrification of the transportation sector, for goodness sakes, electricity is cheaper at night than it is by day. In the future, we're all going to be plugging in the batteries of our electric cars overnight and letting them fully charge when there's a lot less demand for the electricity. And yeah. So the batteries in electric cars are going to be a huge source of battery storage needed to make renewables work.
Yeah, I've also been wondering recently, there's all this visuals I saw of bulldozers bulldozing the spent blades and trying to find places to park them and bury them. And I'm thinking, meanwhile, all the shoreline communities and riverfronts are trying to find barriers to protect themselves from rising sea level and storms. And so I'm wondering if anybody's looking into using the spent blades from these huge turbines to assist in shoring up, these eroding riverbeds or ocean ways.
That's an interesting research area. We're not specifically working on that today, but yes, there are a couple of places where people are starting. The wind turbine industry has only become big in the last 10 or 15 years. So today, there really aren't that many spent wind blades. There sure will be 20 years from now, and that's a topic well worth understanding. But
so I'll get a patent now.
Here.
So John, one other question. I know you are such an expert on the research and development side of things. Where do you see wind going in Maine currently? I know there's a moratorium right now on new wind projects offshore. And I was just wondering, when do you think we will see offshore wind being a big deal in Maine?
You know what? I'm an engineer, not a politician. The point I wanted to emphasize is that it's a very, very, very big ocean. And the 7 years I lived in New Zealand, the wind farms we put up coexisted peacefully with other land uses. And my hope is that because the offshore wind resource only needs 2 or 3% of all of that ocean space, my hope is that politically and socially, we can find a way to share that ocean and to allocate a pretty small portion of it for harvesting wind energy while allowing all of the other traditional uses of the ocean to do what they need. So,
thank you.
But I'm not a politician, I'm just an engineer.
Totally get it. Thank you. But I think those are great talking points for us who are trying to talk to our legislators and our representatives and to say, we only need a couple % of this. We're not talking about putting wind turbines all over the Gulf, So thank you. I appreciate your thoughts on
Could
that.
I add one thing? It was just a few weeks ago, President Biden made a goal of installing 30,000 megawatts of offshore wind by 2030. So it's getting national attention. And I know in Massachusetts, they're really moving fast to be a leader. And so we will learn from their experience, right? What goes well there, because they're really in the final stages of bringing on their first offshore wind farm in Massachusetts.
If I could say 30,000 megawatts, that's 30 gigawatts. That's less than 20% of what we've got available only in the Gulf of Maine. Never mind the rest of New England, never mind Northern California, Southern Oregon. So yeah, no, I think the 30 gigawatt goal is pretty consistent with about 3% of what we've got in the Gulf of Maine, together with some capacity in other parts of New England, Northern California, and Oregon.
And like you said, John, the wind profile is great. And I mean, we are exploiting our forests. So it's not like the wind turbines are going to ruin our ocean. They may kill just a bird or two, but I think it's a really promising area and could help hopefully alleviate some of the biomass burning if we figure out offshore wind.
Here, here.
Great, thank you so much. Let's see here. Next up, we have Leslie Bowman. She is a photographer and associate professor at the University of Maine at Machias. She is the widow of Norman LaBerge, project director of Half Moon Cove Tidal Power Project. Zell Bowman LaBerge, their daughter, is an architect. Welcome so much, Leslie. Oh, I meant to mention, Leslie has a spotty internet connection, so she has pre-recorded her 4-minute presentation, and we're going to play that for you now, and then she will hopefully be available after for Q&A. She is on the call. Thank you. Welcome, Leslie.
Give me just a second. I'll get this up and running. Oops. Sorry about that. Let me try this again.
Is not new to our region in Maine, the easternmost coastal area in Maine. The proposals for tidal power were first conceived in the 1920s by Dexter Cooper and supported by President Roosevelt. And the original plans called for an international project that would generate huge amounts of power by damming off Passamaquoddy Bay from Cobscook Bay and generating power as a two-pool system. The proponents said that this would be bring in huge amounts of industry and prosperity for the region. It would have dramatically changed the region. And for various reasons, it was not manifested, but part of the project was built in the 30s. You have Quoddy Village, which housed workers, and then you had the dams. This causeway and this causeway were built in the 30s as phase 1 of the project. Before that time, to get into Eastport, you had to go across the old toll bridge. So by building these causeways, the toll bridge eventually came down. Well, this is the Sabayak Reservation, Passamaquoddy Reservation, and people in the middle of the reservation do not quite appreciate this road coming all the way through. And it was in the 70s, the late 1970s, that members of the tribe proposed doing a tidal project. And that's when they hired Norman LaBerge, who is my late husband. And I have been involved in this project and watched it throughout the years. But The idea was to put a dam here and generate power as the water came in and out. That's the toll bridge. It came down in the 50s. And this is what that area looks like now at low tide. The configuration was to put filling gates here so that you could start to open up the waters between Passamaquoddy and Copscook to have nutrient mixing, and then put the powerhouse here with the possibility of putting a road over it. The way that the projects with a barrage work is that you hold back the tide until a certain head is produced, and his last proposal was for a 5-foot rolling head. And then you produce the power as it goes through. The additional power produced by having a barrage is greatly enhanced. Here's a picture of the filling and emptying gates on Passamaquoddy side, which would give the nutrient mixing and that open up that connection between the two, which many environmentalists feel had really diminished the quality of marine life in Copscook. While the barrage produces lots of power, these current devices, such as this one of ORPC, would generate power without a dam, just with the currents. And a considerable amount of interest and money has been poured into these projects because, first of all, you wouldn't have to see them. And a lot of people like things that you don't have to see. But as pointed out in all the reports and studies for the engineering work, is that a barrage with a 5-foot head could produce 16 megawatts of power, the annual demand for 10,000 homes. It would take 300 current devices at this location to produce equal amount of power. Significantly different. Maine was already on track for taking down hydro dams when this second preliminary permit in 2010 was issued, and the capital could not be raised. But how are we going to get into a carbon neutral future without considering diverse renewable energy projects? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Leslie, for that. I really appreciate all you brought to our title knowledge. Are there any questions from the audience?
I just have a question, just to clarify, Leslie. Do you say that things are at a standstill because of funding at this point? Am I understanding that correctly?
There we go. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
The interest, okay, you can hear me now?
Yes. Oh, you're frozen.
For my
now.
announcement, it is at a standstill. And anybody who wants to come take it, go with it, please. It's a great project, and I think each community has to look at how they're going to produce power, and that's why I've always supported this. It's a small, modest project compared to the large one, and yeah, so it's on. I appreciate the opportunity to talk about it today with this group because you're serious about how we're going to go carbon neutral in the future, and there is potential here. Thank you.
Well, it sounds very interesting. Thank you for that information.
Leslie, do you know, are there any other tidal projects being developed in Maine right now like this?
No, my daughter wasn't able to be with us today, and I talked to her. She's more on top of what's going on. No, I mean, we have a history of small scale projects, mills, sawmills and grinding mills. But no, the permitting is probably next to impossible right now until there's a different attitude about how we look at environmental issues, just like the biomass, just like all the things we're talking about. How do we get carbon neutral? Some people would say we're only going to do it with nuclear power. And that's a very scary thing. So I don't know of any in Maine besides ORPC, but they're not really, they're mostly doing river run projects now.
Okay, great. Great, thank you so much for that. There might be some more questions in the end for you, so please stick around, Leslie. Thank you so much. Next up, let me get this off of here. Next up, we have David Costello. David is the Climate and Clean Energy Director at the Natural Resources Council of Maine. He brings more than 25 years of senior level government management and policy experience to NRCM. Previously in Maryland, he served as Director of the Mayor's Office of Community Investment in Baltimore City, Program Manager with the U.S. Agency for International Development, and Deputy Secretary at the Maryland Department of Environment. He is a graduate of UMaine at Orono, George Washington University, and the London School of Economics. So glad to have you here tonight, David. Thank you. Welcome.
Thank you, Jen. It's great to be here, and good evening to everybody. I get to speak, focus on the mother of all energy sources, the sun. It's almost unfathomable the amount of energy that the sun emits every day and hits the planet. One day's worth would likely address our energy needs for 7,000 to 8,000 years. So obviously the challenge is capturing all of that energy. And if you recall Michelle and John's charts, Maine isn't capturing a lot yet. Less than 1% of all the energy that we're utilizing in Maine comes from solar energy. We have about 105 megawatts deployed or operational today, but that's changing. And a couple of things I would say about our future energy mix as we look out towards 2050, when obviously we look to have 100%, well, we look to reduce our emissions considerably and also to basically have 100% of our energy coming from renewable sources. The mix then is likely to be one in which solar is dominant as well as wind, that biomass has receded considerably, although there may be some combined heat and power residual wood energy sources, which quite frankly probably make sense at the time. We'll probably utilize a great deal of, as John talked about, storage is going to be a big issue for both wind and solar. And so we'll probably have at that time a great deal of green, what's called green hydrogen. That's hydrogen fuel, both in gas and liquid form, that is produced by electrolysis, that is using excess wind and solar energy to actually produce a gas and a fuel that would help to address the difficult, sort of difficult sector to address, or sectors to address. For instance, maritime travel, aviation, and heavy industry, and even heavy trucking. To the extent that we don't electrify our large vehicles, then that may be zeroed out. The emissions may be zeroed out by green hydrogen. That's commercially probably a decade away. So that's why I'm talking about that as possibly a very viable and useful source come 2050. One of the things I'd say about Maine's goal, it really should be carbon negative after 2050. I think the governor set a great carbon neutrality goal for 2045. But of course, I think most of us understand that carbon and other greenhouse gases are going to remain in the atmosphere. The negative impacts are going to be with us for decades. So what we need to do, certainly probably starting in 2050, is to look to be a carbon negative state, as well as ultimately a nation that draws carbon out of the atmosphere. But getting back to solar, looking at building out Maine's 105 megawatts now, in 2019, the legislature and the governor enacted a number of fairly progressive and productive pieces of legislation that have helped to spur solar development in Maine. And for instance, when I say there's 105 megawatts roughly deployed or installed currently and operational, in the queue for what's called net energy billing is over 2,600 megawatts. Now, much of that is not going to be installed. There's a probably a 50% attrition rate on projects, but also it's gotten to the point on the net energy billing side that we're starting to worry about rate impact. So the legislature right now is trying to deal with quite frankly, a surge in solar interest in Maine. There's been a lot of interest because of the legislation passed in 2019 to basically install a lot of solar projects, these smaller, below 1 megawatt up to 5 megawatts, so 0 to 5 megawatt. The 0 to 1 megawatt isn't an issue. That's where you've got a lot of behind the meter solar on businesses and homes throughout the state. It's the larger projects that we have to be mindful of, because at some point, the way the system is set up, and that's why we've had this bit of a land rush for solar, is that it would have a rate impact at some point. And I'll get back to that in a minute. The other thing we've done successfully is we've basically subsidized or incentivized grid scale solar. Some of you may recall that that in September, the PUC announced procurement or awards approval of contract sheets for large solar and one wind developer, as well as one biomass developer in Livermore Falls, for 535 megawatts. 483 of that was solar. We've got a second tranche that is underway, which is likely to bring in another 300 megawatts of solar grid scale. And then another procurement that the legislature is undertaking, and we had our first hearing today, to probably procure about 800 additional megawatts. So you can see over the next decade, we're likely to build out 800 to 1,000 megawatts, and we might get upwards of 7,500 megawatts by 2050. So the progress is good. We just have to be mindful of the impacts as we build out the energy sector. I don't know if Dr. Fernandez or John had mentioned this, but we expect to triple the grid, the size of the electric grid in Maine, at least triple by 2050, to account for all of the increased, what we call beneficial electrification of our transportation and our building sector, as we put in more heat pumps, as we electrify. As we obviously see a considerable increase in the purchase and utilization of electric vehicles, as well as if we ever do get in the business of, generating green hydrogen from excess, wind and solar electricity. So I think the future's, obviously a challenge, but it's particularly bright. And again, it's likely to be a transition that obviously I think all of us would agree going to generate a lot of jobs. We're sending over $4 billion out of state for our energy. Much of that can be, domesticated or brought back to Maine. And you can imagine the amount of jobs and economic output, that level of money. And of course, as we build out the grid and we build out all of these generation, the offshore wind that John's talking about, and the solar that I've mentioned. One thing also about wind and solar and storage is that the good news for Maine is wind is best in the winter and during the evening hours, and the sun obviously is best in the summer. So as you look at Maine's energy generation with wind and solar, you'll see how the solar will be more helpful in the summer. Wind will be more helpful when the sun isn't as available. And of course, storage will help to mitigate. And again, likely the largest source of storage may not even be batteries, even though we'll have battery storage. And as John said, a lot of vehicle storage conceivably. But again, green hydrogen is likely to be a large source of storage. But I'm not sure where I am in time. Why don't I stop there and see if leave more time for questions?
So I think David, Linda Stathopoulos has a question for you. What is the embedded carbon footprint of solar panels versus their operational footprint? And Lisa Pagano adds to that, I wonder about this too, with our push for EV and the effect of increased metal mining.
Yeah, well, one of the things, and again, this gets into carbon sequestration. Of course, we'd love to see a lot more embodied carbon in wood products, particularly in buildings. So that is an issue for the solar industry as well as wind and in almost any energy generation facility, where cement, steel, aluminum, glass, all are high carbon emitting industries. And so I don't know the particular of any solar array, obviously, but we are going to have an issue in terms of the embedded carbon or the emitted carbon from the products that are used currently in construction. Now, as we electrify and we zero out the emissions of our industrial sectors, then of course that footprint in producing the steel, the aluminum, those kinds of things, the wiring, that footprint will decline, as it will across all of our industries and sectors in the years ahead. So it is a problem, as well as recycling's a challenge. All of that. I don't know if John knows that actually recycling wind blades. There's a facility in West Virginia, of all places, that is looking to do a good job of recycling wind blades, even taking out the fiberglass, the hydrocarbons that come out. It's very interesting. Of course, it's costly, but you'll see a lot of innovation in recycling, as well as making sure that we're zeroing out the footprint of all of the things that we produce in terms of the products. And of course, the waste stream, we need to zero out our waste stream, but I guess that's probably another evening's discussion.
Absolutely. Oh, thank you so much, David. And I love the concept of carbon negative as opposed to everybody just striving for carbon neutral. I think that is a great, it's just great verbiage for all of us to put out there and start thinking that way, because it's possible. And I love that you bring that up. Thank you so much for your presentation. We're so glad that you're here tonight. We might have some more questions for you after the rest of the speakers. Next up, we have Tom Barry. Let me get this up here. Sorry, I'm not prepared. Let's see. Following a brief career as an RN, Tom Barry earned a master's in speech language pathology and worked in brain injury rehabilitation for several years. Since 1996, he has served in special education in Kennebunk. In 2017, he began devoting more attention to his interest in and concern for the natural world as a member of the Planeteers of Southern Maine, and more recently as a volunteer with Citizens Climate Lobby and the Climate Foundation. Thanks for being here, Tom. Welcome.
Thank you, Jen. And I'm going to go through the motions here of sharing. Okay, so I am a Planeteer, but I'm here also representing Citizens Climate Lobby. For those who don't know, Citizens Climate Lobby is a national grassroots nonprofit whose sole focus is to push for federal legislation to tackle the climate crisis. The specific legislation that CCL has been promoting for a decade can be summed up in the phrase carbon fee and dividend. First, the rationale. There's always been a major flaw in the market system of carbon-based energy. We know the devastating health and environmental costs that have resulted from use of the products sold by fossil fuel companies. These costs have been completely borne by consumers, not to mention millions of non-human species, and never by those corporations. The market-based approach advocated by CCL would correct this flaw, and in so doing, precipitate a cascade of positive effects. So how would carbon fee and dividend work? Simply put, a law that included carbon fee and dividend would require fossil fuel companies to pay an annually increasing fee on the carbon they take out of the ground. The collected fees would go into a trust fund for immediate distribution minus administrative costs as monthly dividend checks to U.S. households for individuals to spend however they like. A question that often comes up at this juncture is, would this kind of law create an unfair burden for people in lower income brackets? This graph is from an independent study conducted by the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis. It shows the projected effect of carbon fee and dividend across income quintiles in the US from lowest to highest. And it shows that the majority of people in lower and middle incomes would actually come out ahead, with the greatest benefit going to those of lower means. As more of the true cost of carbon pollution gets put on fossil fuel companies, the alternative energy sector, which is already beginning to flourish, will become even more competitive. Energy conservation will intensify, and consumers will increasingly transition to alternative sources for their energy needs. People spending their dividends will stimulate local job creation, many of them being in the green energy sector. And as these developments occur, our air and water will be cleaner, and we'll see improvements in the overall health of our citizens. With carbon fee and dividend, our national carbon emissions would decrease by 40% within 12 years and would reach net zero by 2050. So you might be asking at this point, this all sounds interesting, but how does this relate to Maine's climate action plan? The plan does mention carbon pricing, but does not venture into it, recognizing that for such a policy to be effective, it would need to be national in scope. But carbon fee and dividend would have a profound effect on curbing carbon emissions, and that is part of the plan, as we've talked about tonight. And this brings me to Carbon Cash Back for Me. Carbon Cash Back for Me is a statewide initiative that seeks to give Maine citizens a way to convey a powerful message to our elected officials, particularly those in Washington. This effort aims to have an article placed on warrants for town meetings or referendums across the state. If passed by the voters, it would require that town's officials to formally notify our elected representatives in Congress that voters in that community want them to enact climate change legislation that would include carbon fee and dividend as an integral element. Since Senators King and Collins are both members of the Senate Climate Solutions Caucus, our state is uniquely poised to have real influence in the direction that carbon legislation will take. So if you live in Maine and would like to get involved in this effort in your town, you can visit carboncashbackforme.org. If you happen to live in Kennebunk and are registered to vote here and have not yet signed our petition, please do get in touch with me through the Some Planeteers link in the chat. And if you're tuning in from out of state, you can visit citizensclimatelobby.org to see how you can get involved in the national effort. There's much great work being done to head off the threats posed by climate change, and all of it is essential. Maximizing the resiliency we'll need in the coming years, expanding methods for sequestering carbon, boosting energy production from alternative sources. These all require sustained support if we are to have a world livable for humans and a multitude of other species. At the same time, we need to facilitate these efforts by refraining from making our carbon problem worse. We all know that we must drastically curtail our greenhouse gas emissions. And we at CCL believe that the carbon cash back approach would go a long way to making this happen. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Tom. Awesome. Any questions for Tom out there? Thank you for laying out that so clearly, Tom. Next, I was hoping that we could go back to Dr. Ivan Fernandez in case you have anything else that you'd like to sum up for us, Doctor.
Yeah. Thanks, and please call me Ivan. I've learned a lot in the last half hour or so from my fellow speakers, panelists here, some of whom I knew and some of whom I don't. And a lot of really important points. Almost everyone had some key point that changes your framework the more you learn about how you think about these important issues, from the role of wood in our energy mix to green hydrogen that David brought up, which is so important to looking down the road a decade or two, and to the size of the energy that we have offshore and coming from the sun, to think about what the potential is going forward. So it's really exciting. I'll be quick. I think my charge was to talk a little bit about some aspect of what I do sort of in my day job. So I'm going to talk about carbon and the carbon cycle, but very quickly, mostly because that'll be the first time we're really talking about carbon neutrality concepts. And by that, I mean, this is not Maine's main data. This is from the Global Carbon Project. And they put out lovely slides every year and do an analysis of the global sources and sinks of carbon. And we've been focusing mostly tonight over here, talking about trying to get off of fossil fuel combustion, which this represents 86% of the greenhouse gas emissions, or CO2 emissions. And the other 14% here of total emissions is attributable to land use change. And the one that comes to mind the most is tropical deforestation. Tropical rainforests are, a warehouse of carbon, and as we clear them for agriculture and burn them, all of that carbon goes into the atmosphere, not to return for a very long time. The balance for that, when we talk about carbon neutrality, then we're saying, okay, beyond the sources, what are the sinks? In this case, planetary sinks for that carbon. Are there things that are going on that are taking it up? And there, of course, are. About 23% is going into the ocean. That's not a good thing because that's causing ocean acidification. But nevertheless, it's a huge sink that takes place in our oceans, and it's weakening over time. Another, a little more than a quarter, is in land. And that's really the focus of what I'm talking about tonight, or in the next couple of minutes. And what we don't put in the ocean and what we don't put on land ends up as an effluent into the atmosphere that we know better as greenhouse gas emissions. And it's the waste of our activities and our industrial processes. So one of the things that I do work on is the carbon cycle and biogeochemistry of carbon cycling and in the environment. There's a couple of definitions that if you pay attention to sort of the role of particularly forests in the carbon balance that are important. One is carbon storage. Carbon storage is what happens as the trees grow. So as a forest gets older, it accumulates more and more carbon on the landscape to a point. Eventually you get to a point and you're sort of filled up, you're carbon saturated. At that point, the charge is don't mess it up, because if you go backwards, all of that carbon goes pouring back into the atmosphere. And Maine is 89% forested. We have a lot of carbon stored on the landscape. We can store a bit more, and there's a lot of discussion about doing that. But nevertheless, there is an end to that in time. The other is carbon sequestration, and that's the rate at which carbon is taken up by, in this case, a forest. And carbon is taken up by young forests faster than older forests. And as the forests age, as they accumulate, the rate at which they take up the carbon slows down. So on a sort of per acre basis, they're more effective at taking up carbon here. But of course, if they're young forests, that means something happened to the carbon that was there before these forests started to grow. And if it was, burned or put into short-lived products, that means it's back in the atmosphere. If it's stored in long-term products, then that's good. That's the embedded carbon. Old growth forests don't really, have to be really old before they actually go to zero. We're learning more and more about that all the time. So to make a longer story short, we did a volunteer sort of back of the envelope effort a year ago to try and come up with version 1 of the Maine's carbon budget, so the carbon cycle for Maine. And the major component in that, because we are 89% forests, was forest. And so this is a summary and a sort of a visual. These data are not critical here. I want to focus over here on the role that the role that forest is playing in Maine's carbon cycle as compared to the Maine Department of Environmental Protection greenhouse gas emissions reporting. And so that's the benchmark that we have been using. It's biennially a biennial report that's submitted. It's primarily fossil fuels, and so to date it has not included, as far as the reported greenhouse gases, wood. And so what we heard earlier is an important factor. It includes the wood data in the appendix, but by way of the way the laws were written, it has up till now not included that. If we compare what forests are contributing to offsets, or the amount that they're taking up in excess of what we're harvesting, right now our forests are growing faster than we're harvesting. And so they're accumulating carbon. And that accumulation is roughly equal to about 60% of our fossil fuel emissions. If we also count long-term products, durable products, and so wood that's in a structure that we expect to be around for 50 to 100 years, then that's probably another 15% of carbon offset. So the bottom line is we estimated this version 1, about 75% of our reported greenhouse gas emissions are offset at present by the net excess accumulation of carbon in our forests. And so there's a lot of focus on can we do more? Can we put more in durable products? And also, how can we use the focus on forests and farms, as someone mentioned earlier, to use the investments in those resources to improve their health. I think it was Tom that brought up the various natural climate solutions. And so I'll just end with, there's a lot of work around natural climate solutions, and that is how can we improve the resilience? In other words, make our farms healthier, make our wetlands healthier, make our forests healthier, as well as have them take up more carbon so they contribute to mitigation, but the resilience contributes to adaptation. I think that's a really exciting area because it's people are learning about a lot more about our resources and looking at opportunities to invest in them. I think some of it's overhyped as to how we're going to solve the problem by natural climate solutions. We're not. We have to get off fossil fuels. And as I already mentioned, some of these are finite. We can increase the carbon to a point, but then we're going to have to spend just as much energy being sure that we preserve that carbon, because once we stop, it starts to slide backwards and it just goes pouring back into the atmosphere. So with that, the other side of the coin to get to carbon neutrality is to look at how these kinds of things can take up CO2 out of the atmosphere to bring down the net balance of CO2. There are engineered ways to do this, and I'm not a big fan of them. You know, big machines that suck CO2 out of the atmosphere. We are researching that because it may be a need, but hopefully we never have to go down that road, and we can just do the things that we've talked about tonight, moving towards renewables quickly to get off fossil fuels. So with that, thank you.
Oh, thank you so much, Ivan. So much great information. I'm gonna look in the chat here, see if we have any other questions. Does anybody on the Zoom call have any questions for anybody at this time? I think everybody answered their questions as we went throughout the program. I would personally just like to take a moment to thank all of our experts and fabulous presenters tonight. I've for one, have learned so much. And I'm so glad that we have had the opportunity to work with the Kennebunk Free Library. I want to thank Allison and Brittany and everybody at the library for partnering with us and hosting us. And all of you for coming out to gather information and be a part of the community and the conversation tonight. Thank you. And of course, we have another Planet Talk coming up next week, same time, Tuesday night, 6 p.m. If you all can join us, we would love that. Allison, do you have anything?
Just thank you all for coming. And we'll see you next week, I hope.